I like any adventure that's tight, fun, and compact, and Zelda 1 was my first, but the game was too cryptic for a 5-year-old, and although the gold cart was sweet, the game went over my head back then, and I didn't figure out how to get the sword in the first cave of the first screen until years later, and by that time I'd moved on. NES Zelda really just frustrated 6-year-old me, so it sat on the shelf in favor of simpler NES games. I was an NES addict as a kid, and Mario 3 was mine and everyone else's favorite, but platformers were mostly what I wanted to play. And I knew that Zelda was a different kind of game. This is before I knew what an action RPG even was. Zelda and the NES faded out of my life and into obscurity as the legendary system took bottom billing in my console stash. I even felt a little guilt, and by the mid-90s I would take my neglected NES out every now and then, dust it off and hook it up. Mario 3 would usually be in the cartridge slot, and then I'd proceed to get the warp whistles and warp to World 7, then immediately to World 8, then realize I wasn't up for the challenge and turn it off. But my conscience was just nagging me to respect my elder NES. After all, it is the godfather of console gaming. The reverence and respect it receives to this day is truly deserved, if not a little predictable. NES games on the whole are just gimmicky and short, and they harken back to a simpler time in game development. I know there are amazing titles all over the system, and I loved my NES, but once I put it down I never really picked it back up. That's still mostly the case today. If I'm looking for an old school 2D system nowadays, I aim squarely for the Super Nintendo.
A bit more colorful, a bit more realistic, a bit more levels, a bit more secret, a bit more enemies, a bit more friends, a bit more sound, a bit hotter, a bit cooler, a bit weird, a bit more revolutionary, a bit more Mario, a bit more of what you want. It's 16-bit, and it's yours only if you get new Super Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
I cherish the Super NES. It was the one that got away in the Nintendo console that made me envious like nothing else could for a Genesis owner in '94. This was the height of the 16-bit console war. This was the height of Super Nintendo versus Sega on the school bus. And 2 to 3 years later, after doing a 180 and going all in for the N around '97, I had every Nintendo system but the SNES. Okay, I also didn't have the Virtual Boy, but I didn't want one. Like I said, the NES did mean a lot to me as a kid, so after dipping my toes in with the Play It Loud Game Boy and doing a backflip off the diving board with the N64, I set my sights on the other great Nintendo system. You see, I'd struck out with friends and family repeatedly. Even some of my own relatives refused to let me borrow their SNES, and one of the most coveted games for me was... what else? Link to the Past had my attention. It was a drastic improvement over Zelda 1, and if for no other reason than the bidirectional sword swipe, which thankfully now gives Link some semblance of defense and actual precision aim with his sword. Zelda 1's mechanics end up feeling more like a chore than anything, however, and the subtle upgraded moveset and deeper mechanical depth of LTTP combined with the lush 16-bit pixel art depiction of Hyrule, and I knew this game kicked ass. I always got to play the opening section at other people's houses, so I knew how hard Nintendo had upped the ante on this one. In addition to the graphical upgrades, the game's music and story benefited from the increased storage capacity of the SNES. Link to the Past features some seriously bombastic orchestral arrangements and what has to be some of my favorite early work from renowned composer and living legend Koji Kondo. Link to the Past soundtrack really took the game up a notch, and the final product is a statement from Nintendo. Luckily for us, Koji Kondo would stick around for a few more projects, and come to think of it, Koji Kondo also made the music for Mario Bros. 3 and Star Fox 64 and... oh, I see. So I was cold on Zelda 1, but Link to the Past was my shit. I just didn't own it and I couldn't play it yet. Even then, I loved that video games were such an evolving medium. I shudder at the thought of being born in an alternate timeline where video games never existed or haven't been invented yet, It always amazes me that I've been lucky enough to be a kid in the age of Nintendo and their Japanese products sweeping through my home country. So yeah, I was lucky, and I was even luckier to own a Game Gear, an NES, and a Genesis all at once. But what I really loved were 2D platformers: Sonic, Mario, Earthworm Jim, Vector Man, Contra, DKC, whatever. I love platformers. Mario was fascinating because of how the levels connected to each other, and the addition of a playable, traversable world map in Mario 3 kicked it into overdrive. I would daydream about new levels that didn't exist. And I had a comic book where Mario hangs out underwater in a series of pipes with Bertha the fish. And my cousin's house where I was visiting had a bunch of saltwater fish tanks. I always remember that weird Mario comic book and the awesome underwater artwork and just the way it depicted the pipes. It's something like fundamental and mechanical in my brain, but machines just speak to me, and I'll bet they speak to the Mario devs too. That comic book just made me want to play Mario 3 more. The diversity of biomes and network of pipes, tunnels, warps, and worlds, along with the colorful characters and fascinating art style. The way the Mushroom Kingdom is depicted in Mario 3 remains iconic. It has cult status on the Mount Rushmore of gaming, as it should. Zelda 1 may have been top-down and different from the 2D side-scrolling action platformers I was used to, but I could tell the new perspective was in service of the game's slower, more methodical premise of discovery and exploration rather than the Mario and Sonic gameplay loop of going as fast as possible while avoiding and stopping enemies to reach the end of the stage. Skilled players will memorize the enemies and layout and then proceed to fly through the level. Mario and Sonic are kinetic experiences where fluid motion and approachable physics are key to both games, even if they feel radically different to play. RPG was a brand new acronym for me, something I'd been reading about in EGM magazine. Lots of D&D adjacent gamers, or the kind of guys who would write letters to the editor, were super into this stuff. I was getting my first glimpse of a fandom. RPGs as a genre were new and mysterious to me. It's something that the older kids did. They also had a dorky reputation, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but figuring out why, RPGs appeared to be menu-driven, stat-driven, and generally were lacking most of the interesting physics that made platformers tick, but they traded that for a depth of inhabitants and locales to explore. On the whole, 8 and 16-bit systems are defined by a slew of attempts, and some successful and some not, at translating a real-life or fantastical scenario into a playable experience. So the SNES was essentially an iteration on the NES that did the same basic games, just better. Final Fantasy VI was the culmination of all this, a technical marvel for its time. FF6, or 3 as it was called in the West, shows what can be done in 16 bits when the dev teams pull out all the stops and refuse to allow the medium to limit artistic expression. RPG fans yearn for the feeling one gets whilst embarking on a grand adventure, or the sensation of heading out to explore the unknown. Seeing their character grow during a playthrough is super satisfying, as is pulling up an old save file that's been maxed out and just admiring your inventory screen. Fun fact, during this playthrough of OOT, I managed to permanently lose the Zora tunic after getting it swallowed by a like in Ganon's Tower. RPGs are the anti-platformer, trading in slick, speedy motion for a bag full of equipment and items. Zelda 3 on the NES may not be a traditional JRPG like Chrono Trigger, but the element of character growth, new items, and upgrades I think are what classify it partly as an RPG. It's the questing, the embarking, the journey that nerds crave. The proposition of finding new items along the way that makes it rewarding, and the give and take between Link's growing arsenal and the game's rising difficulty. Even though I had a decent N64 library, by summer of '97 I was still playing Mario 64 more than anything. I loved booting up the game and running around the castle courtyard, going down the sewer drain at the bottom of the moat, and ending up back at the waterfall or cave area with the green metal Mario switch. After 120 starring my original save file, I would have the same routine: boot the game up, get 99 lives from Yoshi on the roof, then head to Lethal Lava Land or Shifting Sand Land, and skate around on a Koopa shell like it was Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. I did own the real Tony Hawk at some point after first trying the demo on PC in '99, but before that gem even came out, Mario 64 was allowing that type of experience, that free-form, non-tank control movement that felt oh so natural with the analog stick. So basically, Mario 64 contains other genres of game within itself, which was very cool to me at 13. The overall complexity and expressiveness of Mario 64's moveset was such a leap from its 16 and 8-bit forebears that it was probably the first game that I truly fell in love with for its mechanics as well as the game in general. Mario 3's depth was all coming from the X and Y axis. Miyamoto and his uber-talented team of programmers gave Mario complex, variable speed and realistic momentum. The subtle transfer of motion as Mario accelerates to a sprint, jumps, hops around, and lands with precision on platforms is just so good, and it always has been. Mario may appear simplistic, but great care was taken in the way Mario feels to move around. It's all about feel, and you know Nintendo dialed that shit in perfectly. I knew instinctively that once the N64 came out, once 3D games were the standard, games would get exponentially cooler. There's simply no substitute for being able to represent the third dimension inside our computer software, as hard as we tried. I love the Super NES, but there's a reason why my heart always lands on the N64. Maybe it was my age, but however it coincided, by July that year, I was finally bored of Mario 64. Now I was looking for a worthy successor. Everyone knew the next Zelda game, for N64 and 3D, would eventually be out, but we still had a year to go. I was just looking for something, anything that would fill the void for a little while. Since Mario Kart was also an excellent early release, I took a chance on Diddy Kong Racing, and was rewarded handsomely for it. I actually loved Diddy Kong Racing. I beat all the challenges, stomped on Whiz Pig, and the fact that it was a racing game was sort of tangential, really. I loved DKR for the adventure mode and the unlockables. I just loved the idea of a little interlocking stages and areas on an island that open up bit by bit as you perform different challenges. It's just satisfying. DKR had filled the gap nicely in between Mario 64 and Summer '98. But one humid night, my mom took me to Toys R Us in Northwest Houston like we usually did, and with my birthday money, I bought Banjo-Kazooie. I remember really hoping that Banjo would be another Mario 64, which is what I wanted after all, and the game didn't disappoint. I didn't care for the Banjo-Kazooie's character aesthetics at first, the witch, the monsters, and the Halloween-y vibe. It was all kind of cheesy to me then, and still is, but despite me not being stoked on the character models, I took a chance and it ended up being the funnest, meatiest adventure on the N64. It was something new that wasn't Mario, and I could sink my teeth into it for a few months until the new Zelda game came out, and for that I've always appreciated it. School was back in session fall '98, and Banjo-Kazooie had served its purpose as a fun pre-Ocarina adventure, and I never picked up Tooie on the 64 when it was current, but I will eventually. Most of the N64 games that I played and cared about were by Rare and Nintendo, so it made sense that DKR fucking ruled. Diddy Kong Racing was a sleeper hit and a surprise banger. It also happened to be Banjo's first official game. I completed Banjo, but my cousin deleted my save file when he came over to my house for Thanksgiving that year. I let him play my N64 for a little while, and the next time I booted my game up, my entire save file was deleted. I always remembered that dick move that my cuz pulled, but it was all good for me because life was good. One night during the same Thanksgiving break, and my best bud Chad was spending the night, we ended up going to Blockbuster, and somehow we were able to rent a gray cartridge copy of Ocarina of Time. I don't remember if it was hard to get, but whatever the case, we had it, and we were now actually playing Ocarina of Time for the very first time. Even though my gold collector's copy was still sitting in a Toys R Us warehouse.